Good afternoon, bonjour, assalamu alaikum, mwiriwe neza, General, senior RDF officials, Mr. Senators and members of the representative of the chambers, members of the diplomatic corps, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I greet you in all those languages. My name is Alice Urusaro Karekezi. I'm the moderator of this distinguished panel. I would like to invite the representative of ICRC, Mr. Pascal Kouta, to come and to welcome you to this session.
The world is urbanizing, and with that, wars are moving into cities and affecting different categories of people, different categories of civilians. It's a massive development over the last few years. So that's one good reason to have the discussion this afternoon. The other one is a good reason to have it here in Kigali, because we would like to bring an African perspective to the discussions, and that's why we have this panel today. We also would like to do it in Kigali because it is a good place, we think, to have policy discussions. Humanitarian work needs a backup. The practical work we're doing in the field needs a policy backup, a policy input. And we find that this is a good place to have it. So we're proud, we're happy that we can do it. And I would like to thank the panelists, some of whom, Mr. Dieng, have traveled very far to be here. I appreciate on this afternoon the presence of all of you on a day which should be off for many of us, including those in attendance here. So thank you for all of you, to all of you for being here.
Senators, generals, distinguished guests, and dear colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be here. I will not take too much of your time, but before giving the floor to Alice, who has kindly accepted to do the moderation tonight, I just wanted to give you a few words, a kind of background information about why the ICRC is doing this year a series of events on war in cities. So it's actually the fourth event, the fourth conference cycle, the ICRC is organizing. So with the first one we had was on new technologies. Then we had another one on the different principles guiding humanitarian action. And last year we focused on how to better generate respect of the law. So this year, 2017, is the year where we decide to speak a bit more, to deepen the subject of war in cities. And let me explain you a bit why we have decided that this thematic needs more attention. So it first started with, so we're organizing this series of events, and beside that we also published an issue in our academic journal that maybe some of you may know, the International Review of the Red Cross, where you will find a series of of articles from very multidisciplinary domains. So you have some urban architects, you have of course academics, diplomats, military, and they all give their own perspectives about what are today the legal and operational challenges when it comes to war in cities. So you can find of course all this information online, and yeah, I welcome you to have a look at it. Here tonight, as we know, the African continent is also faced with those challenges, and we're also seeing a shift from rural to urban armed conflict, a shift that is likely to grow in the near future. So we are very happy to bring another African perspective to this series of debates we have started last year. And we hope tonight that we can draw on lessons learned from current and past events in the region. And so it's a great pleasure of hosting a very distinguished and rich panel tonight, which will bring various perspectives, diplomatic, military, academic, and humanitarian experience from the field. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I will leave the floor to Alice to introduce you to the panel and start this interesting debate tonight. Thank you.
It is obvious that this conversation will require not only one perspective, within the African perspective, but different ways to understand what we are faced with today.
It is urgent to stop the erosion of the respect for international humanitarian law. And what we intend to do in these few minutes I have been allocated is to share with you some thoughts on the importance of respect for the international humanitarian law in light of the evolving nature of armed conflicts, which more than ever disproportionately impact civilians in urban dwellings. The ongoing violations and disregard of IHL and its devastating impact on the lives of civilians and key infrastructures that sustain their livelihood is a constant reminder for us to do more and ensure respect of IHL for both state and non-state actors to protect civilians. The ongoing conflict in Central African Republic, South Sudan, Burundi, and elsewhere, you can add in the list Nigeria, Cameroon, Somalia, etc., is a grim reminder of human suffering and immense destruction that conflicts entails. What is evident is that both states and non-state actors alike are keenly aware of their obligations under IHL. But as ICRC has demonstrated over the years, and especially through this timely initiative of war in cities, the methods and weapons of warfare have changed tremendously. Today, conflicts are no longer limited to bushes and peripheral. Conflicts are increasingly waged in urban settings and with devastating consequences for the urban dwellers. Key infrastructures essential for livelihood, like water systems, health facilities, education, and business establishment, get destroyed. Further, weapons employed are no longer limited to conventional weapons. Rather, explosive weapons, suicide vests, among many others, are now part of the norm rather than an exception. All these developments require changes in our strategic thinking how to meaningfully confront them. Nowhere the sobering reality of modern-day conflicts is prevalent than Africa. Today, it is no longer states that are exclusively engaged in armed conflicts. Participation of non-state actors in African conflicts continue to present serious challenges to the IHL as the primary legal framework to regulate conduct of hostilities. Rebel groups, some with undefined objectives and command, play a central role in the fighting. Ensuring that these rebel groups adhere to the universally accepted norms regulating hostilities is increasingly difficult. It is only when we put lives of the people at the centrality of protection and accountability that we can truly contribute to the ultimate goal of ensuring that warring parties in conflict respect the basic tenets of universally recognized principles of international law. And I cannot conclude without saying that what we have been witnessing in recent days in cities like Bamako or in Mogadishu, elsewhere, the level of violence we are seeing command us to really maybe also think about how to organize the cities in this today world. But first and foremost, I think what is critical is that there be a recommitment of member states to ensure the respect of IHL. Unfortunately, what we have seen is that today, even powerful countries have been violating ISL in conflicts around the world.
The first things I wanted to show you is a few graphs. As engineers, I like when there's a bit of figures and graphs in my presentations. This is just showing, these three graphics show that basically the bulk of the population growth will take place in Africa in the coming years. That most of this growth will take place, maybe so the upper one is just showing the growth of population per region, while this graph here with not so clear colors show that most of the population growth will take place in cities. Currently, Africa is one of the least, the least urbanized continent, but it is steadily catching up. And we can see from the final graph here that in fact the urban population is expected to double within the next 25-30 years. We are talking around, I think it's like 500 million people, so it's really a tremendous number of people. It's a very big challenge. Already we see that providing adequate services to the population in urban areas is a big challenge. Here I'm just having quickly a few pictures. I don't know if they're showing very well pictures for some of our activities. That's, for example, an emergency water treatment plant that was implemented in Juba during cholera outbreaks. That's the construction of a new pumping station in Goma. Here, that's some old pumps in Maiduguri, Nigeria, that we are planning to change. And this is in central Bangui, a main pipeline that has been replaced. So that's the kind of projects that we're implementing. So in the implementation of these projects, we are facing first, as engineers, we are coming and we have to provide water to the people. The first challenges that we are meeting are technical challenges. Rather than detailing my passion about how to change a pump or how to replace a pipeline, I just try to group these things in some more broad concept. So the challenges that maybe internally already we feel, like having sufficient HR in context where it's difficult to staff the position well, how to implement the projects. It's sometimes difficult in conflict-affected context to find contractors, some people who can do the work, so sometimes we have to do it ourselves. It's also, logistics are also complicated. And we also are facing other type of technical challenges more linked to the context and situations where they are. I've mentioned here, for example, the lack of information on the existing systems, no baseline data, no information about what has been done, because very often system dates from decades ago. And the last point maybe where I wanted to insist is a bit the contradiction between what I would call urgent and post-conflict measures, meaning that there are some projects, typically water trucking, is providing water straight away to the population, but it has absolutely no sustainability, and from the moment we stop funding it, well, people are in the same situation as before. And on the other hand, we would like sometimes to implement measures for building a new water treatment plant or things like that, and these are projects which take a lot of time to implement between the studies, the works and so on. And so we always have a bit to balance on how to be able to meet the needs that are immediate and also to pave way to have sustainable solutions.
So they are expected standard principles and rules contained in international humanitarian law, against which the planning and conduct of hostilities are judged. These standards are aimed at ensuring protection of civilian and civilian objects. Here, civilian objects, I mean any object that is not a military objective. One of these principles is observing the rule of distinction. This is meant to distinguish between civilian and military targets. That is between combatant and non-combatant targets, and also to avoid indiscriminate attacks. Verification is supposed to be done to ensure that prospective targets are indeed military objectives, but this requires one, verification of military objectives in a good time, evaluation of accuracy and reliability of target information, and a detailed assessment of the number and location of both civilian and civilian objects surrounding the prospective military objective. Principle number 2 is about observing the rule of proportionality. This takes into account the following elements. 1, location of civilian and civilian object in relation to military objective. 2, accuracy of weapons, whether they are precise or imprecise, and the nature of weapons, whether they are lethal or non-lethal. It also takes into account the nature of military objective and the consequences resulting from its attack. For example, if you are attacking a bridge, is it likely to lead into floods in case it is destroyed? These are some of the considerations that are supposed to be taken. Disorganized and unplanned cities with high population and poor infrastructure, and in most cases with no elaborate maps. This is also another challenge. So fighting here is likely to result in high number of civilian casualties, and humanitarian operations will also be difficult to conduct. So lack of advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets and technology also leads to some inabilities. For example, it's known that when you fight during the day in urban cities, many people are likely to die. So the armies or the militaries that are able to fight at night are those that have these assets. So they will definitely choose to fight during the night instead of going into streets during the day. Lack of a clear understanding of political objective. For example, why raise down a city when tomorrow you will need it? You may find there is a gap when it comes to political objective. Way forward, the following should be done to ensure protection of civilian objects, including critical infrastructure. 1 is selecting the appropriate means and methods of warfare. 2, training in international humanitarian law is an imperative because it helps shape the planning and conduct of operations, as well as understanding the penalties or sanctions for non-compliance. 3, unconventional and inappropriate means and methods of warfare that tempt the opposing force to react inappropriately should always be analyzed properly before taking an action and should be emphasized in all IHL trainings. 4, civilians should be encouraged and assisted to develop and refine strategies to protect themselves. 5, the belligerent forces should always work closely with various partners and in particular humanitarian actors and experts in urban matters, especially those in cities experiencing conflict. 6, international humanitarian law should be domesticated and all incorporated in national legislations, defense policies, military doctrine, disciplinary codes of conduct, and various military manuals. 7, while the defense policy and various legal instruments may be clear on international humanitarian law, there is need to have clear and well-articulated rules of engagement and context-specific operational orders. 8, appropriate action should be taken against members of armed forces and armed groups in case of crime or grave misconduct in violation of international humanitarian law. 9, which is the last, lessons learned, good practices, and policies on mitigating civilian harm in urban combat should be shared with the view to adopting those that are relevant and context-specific. In conclusion, despite their differences in ideology, motivation, interests and military capabilities, the attacking and defending parties should always ensure maximum protection of civilian objects, including critical infrastructure.
African cities are under tension, and this tension is increasing. After celebrating Africa Rising, we're talking more and more about Africa uprising. Since 2005, the number of protests, riots, has multiplied by 10, and most of them has taken place in cities. Finally, there's an episode is particularly favorable to the explosion of violence, that is elections. Even in countries that are more or less stable, in the time of election, there is more and more a fear of an eruption of violence. This was the case for the election in Nigeria, to a less extent in Ghana, and I think most of us are holding our breath for Kenya. It is a question of turning the relationship between election and protection of population on its head. Instead of being taken as a benchmark to start reduce protection of population, they should be taken as what they really are, as red flags that signal the need for strengthened protection in the short and medium term. Finally, for the communities and local organizations, they should not be carried out by the electoral favors and see in them, yes, an opportunity, but also a danger. They should engage in dialogue processes, confidence building, and mutual protection mechanisms before elections. These mechanisms should focus primarily on the control of young men. These local action should, of course, be based on the most important social fault line, such as ethnicity or religion. Every time a crisis breaks out, we hear experts explaining that the conflict is not about identity, it's about politics. Of course, it is true. But once violence has broke out, often it is only a matter of time before political entrepreneurs manage to mobilize supporters on the easiest, using the easiest tools, that is identity and the prospect of looting.
I really look forward to your questions. I think you have many of them. Please feel free to share with us.
My name is Mary. I'm the director and founder of the Rwanda Women's Network. It's very important for me as a woman who comes from a women's organization also to begin to reflect around the impact of wars in cities, in the urban areas around women. It's not a secret. They are the most affected. And unfortunately, among all speakers, I didn't feel that that was really a subject coming on board. But let me hope, especially to Adama, who is so much at that global space, will always, back of your mind, feel that women matter a lot, because actually even the backbone of our societies.
I'm Richard Moncrief. I'm the Central Africa Director for International Crisis Group, which is an international NGO working on conflict resolution and conflict management. I'd just like to follow Dr. Kimonyo, because you talked essentially about conflicts which are generated within cities and how that works and what the dynamics are, which I felt was a very interesting aspect of this. And I want to raise the question of circulation of information and the information environment we're in. Some of it is old and well known, and of course well known in this country concerning circulation of hate speech. You don't need social media to do that. We've known that for a long time. But some of it is of course new, because we're looking at the very rapid circulation of information and opinion, unmediated, unedited, not going through traditional editorial processes, and circulating on the ground, in particular in urban areas, because the reactions to information and opinion can be much faster in urban areas. And we've seen that very much in many contexts recently. Now, I think this poses a number of challenges. It would be very interesting to get your views on them. Firstly, of course, there is the challenge of the circulation of perfectly legitimate political opinion on social media. Then there is the circulation of inflammatory opinion and hate speech. And of course, as we know, there is a work to try to distinguish between those two things. Then we've seen the circulation of evidence. I really, please. 1 minute, I will go as fast as I can. Then we've seen the circulation of evidence of abuses and evidence of violence on social media. That's another very interesting question. For example, the very inflammatory comments of a Burundian senator in, I believe, December 2015 would not have come out at all if someone had not recorded them on their mobile phone in the meeting. So that's another very important and somewhat new aspect to this. Then we have the issue of fake news, of people fabricating fake news. And finally, we have the issue of denying real evidence of violence and abuses through calling it fake news. And I've been seeing evidence of exactly that in Anglophone Cameroon just recently, but that's just one example amongst many. So a whole series of issues concerning information, how information is feeding into violence in the urban setting, but also can inform us about that violence. So it's not just a negative. And this is an issue where we are balancing opportunities and risks and the negative and the positive of the new information environment.
Talking about war shifting from rural areas to urban areas, I would rather say that today, as long as there is war, it will reach the city. I think either it will start in the city itself, or if it starts outside the city, it will come toward the city because the city is the center of the power and always the conflict. And maybe as an example, we hear in World War I or II, people would say we want to capture Berlin, we want to capture Moscow, then Hiroshima and Nagasaki will be bombed to subdue people because if you capture the city, you have captured the power. So whether we like it or not, therefore, I think we shall see conflict moving either from the urban area, for rural areas to urban cities, or starting from the city itself and continue there. So I would rather think, since either we prevent the war, but if the war is there, how do we, when people are talking about smart cities maybe, how do we factor in the idea of protecting civilians should war in cities occur? Are we going to create some safe areas where the civilians will be going when the conflict erupts? Or are we going to use technology to make sure there is somewhere, in one way or another, we defend our population? How do we protect our civilian in the city, since we know that probably the conflict or war will erupt again? And lastly, maybe, it's about the way forward. Talking about war in cities in African perspectives, I thank very much Ken Ogil, and he gave us a lot of measures that can help us. But again, we need to see where we are as Africans. If we look at the different issues we are talking about, such as precision, to use conventional means, to use guided weapons, maybe to be sure that we are getting at our real target we want. Are we going to be able to do it today as Africans? And if we cannot, what do we do? So I think we need to put a lot of efforts on to protect the civilians, first of all, and at least to see if we have seen that war is going to be likely to erupt tomorrow, then how do we build our cities to make sure that somehow, somewhere, we may protect our civilians? Thank you very much.